Hello, and thanks for joining us. I'm Nicholas Kwalik here for Voice of the People. Thank you so much for being with us. Today, we're talking about North Dakota property taxes. Joining us today is Dr. Rick Becker. Dr. Becker is the chairman of End Unfair Property Tax. He's also circulating a petition right now, needing 31,165 signatures to get that issue on this November's election ballot. Also joining us is the former mayor of the city of Minot, Sean Sitma. Gentlemen, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Dr. Becker, let's start with you. First of all, just take us back. What were some of the reasons you chose to get behind the possibility of, as you say, ending unfair property tax?
Right. Well, property tax is the number one complaint of the citizens of North Dakota. I was in the legislature for 10 years. We as legislators all recognize that. That's what we heard when we were going door to door, number one concern. During my time in the legislature, we also, as a legislative body, tried to do improvements, tried to do property tax relief, and certainly tried to pass property tax reform. But it turned out that what we had attempted in the form of relief didn't work, and most of the time, any kind of reform that was brought up never passed. And so we had, from the time of the 2012 initiated measure that was to eliminate property tax, a 12-year period where we had promised the people of North Dakota that we were going to give relief and reform, and it just never materialized. So now we're in this present day where we still have a tremendous amount of revenue in the state, and yet property tax is still the number one complaint of North Dakota citizens. So we are in a very unique position, unlike any other state in the nation, where we can actually address it, where we can give the relief and the reform without losing any services, without raising any taxes. So that's what this measure is all about.
Sean, you spent some time in office as well. What did you hear from citizens up in Minot regarding property taxes during your time in office?
You know, the interesting thing with property taxes, it's the number one complaint from anyone in any city, any county or township, or any place that anyone lives that pays property taxes. The interesting point that, we talk about or hear about is the unfair side of it. And what I got to see as mayor is really what those are paying for. In Minot, for instance, and this isn't for every city, but 80% of just the property tax for the municipality, the city itself, goes to pay for fire and police. And you take a look at what it takes to run a city and take a look at the inflationary costs that the state legislature itself found exorbitant throughout the probably last 4 or 5 years. That all tails back down to the city level. And absolutely, if we want to just maintain basic services, that's what we saw is dealing with those inflationary costs and just dealing with basic services. You talk about the initiated measure that's come forward. I got to be honest, I was intrigued by the idea on how this could be funded, and we'll probably talk a little more about that here in a moment. But that's really what spurred me into doing the deep dive myself. I'm not part of any group. I'm not part of any coalition that is for or against. But taking a look at the actual measure, the wording, and how that would impact, in this case, the city where I live, and then taking a look at all of the different studies that have happened around the country in other areas that have done this, that have tried to do this, and also taking a look at what actually follows after some of those have passed. So that's what got me sitting here today.
Sure. Well, again, we appreciate you both being here. Dr. Becker, back to you. Now, Sean just mentioned the language of the initiated measure. Now, the wording of it is ending unfair property tax. We had some questions and concerns from our viewers. The wording is, as it is, unfair property tax. So are you saying you're wanting to end unfair property tax and not all property tax?
Well, yeah, interesting question. So the name of the sponsoring committee is End Unfair Property Tax. Nothing about unfair is in the measure itself. There are different components to this quote unquote unfairness aspect. I mean, arguably any property tax where you allegedly own property, but if you're not able to pay the ever increasing property taxes and the government can take your property away, we have to ask, did you really own that property? Some of what's unfair, a lot of what's unfair has to do with the valuation. The valuation increases many times over which people have no control. There's a significant lack of transparency to it. And yet that causes taxes to go up. It's a covert kind of tax because city officials, county officials aren't technically raising your taxes, yet you're paying a lot more in taxes. People generally feel that they have very little recourse. And in fact, they do have very little recourse because the locals are forced by the state to be within a very limited window of sales ratio. So there are significant unfair components to it. You have a person who hasn't done anything to their home. They've been living there for 30 years, but there happens to be a lot of development around their home. Suddenly they're paying way more in taxes. They may be on a fixed income. If that's not unfair, I don't know what is. But to more directly answer your question, this measure, I believe it's in the very first sentence of it, it prohibits the state or any subdivision from levying a tax, a valuation-based property tax. So the ad valorem taxes, so those go away. And so, yes, it addresses unfair property tax. It addresses and reforms property tax so that there is no longer any tax associated with property based on valuations.
Sean, your reaction to that?
Well, I think taking a look at the branding of it, I guess I don't view it as unfair tax. Is the issue is we are paying for services. We're paying for snow removal. We're paying for police and fire and the infrastructure that puts value to our homes. Now, I can't disagree with Dr. Becker in the sense that the county in this case would have the ability to come back and take ownership of that. I think that there are potential ways of addressing that in the future, as well as one of the points that I made even as mayor, that the state law that requires that valuation increase to, dependent upon what the valuations of sales or development around you. I think that that's something that definitely can be addressed at a state level if we got really serious about it. But in this case, throwing the baby out with the bathwater and just saying, property taxes, it's a burden. We just need to get rid of it and push it to another tax. What I found in a lot of other circumstances where states got rid of their property taxes, they pushed those to sales tax revenues. And the interesting thing about this, and this is several studies that have been done, not just in one or two states, but pretty much across the country, where when you push that revenue source to the sales tax area, you're actually impacting so much more and inversely the lower income folks because they're not getting the benefit of a property tax relief. Most of those folks don't own homes, they rent. So what it actually means is their purchase power is now even less because they're paying more in sales tax dollars than they were before. They're not capitalizing. And I'm not naive enough to think that if somebody's property taxes go away on an apartment unit, that their rent is just going to go down. The other side of sales tax revenues that it was notated in a couple of areas that I found, if they have large bordering cities that are next to another state that doesn't have that same higher sales tax, people are very fiscally mindful. They're going to run across the border and purchase things that are cheaper. So it's just kind of the analogy that I have found on the short end. There's much more that we can talk about in I guess my perception of this, but I'll end this at those points for now.
Well, and actually you mentioned it because speaking of sales tax, our neighbors right next door, Minnesota, they have a general sales tax. So you don't have to pay taxes on certain items like clothing, for example. Dr. Becker, would that be something worth exploring if this measure doesn't pass?
No, I mean, that's a totally unrelated thing. I mean, we could look at it. I mean, could look at Montana has no sales tax at all. You could look at South Dakota has no income tax at all. So there are no other states that have gotten rid of the property tax. So I don't know if you can look at studies and say this is what happens. We would be the first to get rid of property tax. And the idea, addressing concerns about a disparity in the sales tax rate between states doesn't really isn't a significant component of any discussion that we're having here because nothing says you need to raise the sales tax. You can if you want. See, this is one of the beautiful things about this measure is we actually give locals more control when we do away with the property tax as it's currently written. The property tax as it's written has tremendous amount of restrictions on it. There are pages and pages in the Century Code that tie the hands of local elected officials on how much they can raise, how they can raise it, so on and so forth. Not only that, but there are indirect aspects tying their hands on whether they can lower it. They can't decrease valuations. If they're doing well and they want to give their people a break, they can't decrease a valuation because the state will come in and force them to increase it. They can't, well, they could, but if they try and decrease the mills, then they start to lose out on state funding for roads, state funding for schools. So they're caught in a corner. Tremendous amount of restrictions. You get rid of the current method of property tax and you say, you know what, we're going to take the shackles off. Legislation will be introduced so that all cities will have some of the aspects of home rule cities where they can raise the revenue as they see fit. Then you're talking a city, a county, school district, township can implement, if they want, they can raise the sales tax. But as former mayor says, if that's going to be harmful, then don't do it. You don't have to. You can implement fees and taxes in other ways, and they can be specifically tied to the users of those services, which a lot of times is going to mean a property owner. Nothing says you can't apply a fee or a tax to property owners, but it cannot be done the way it currently is, which is this covert, very unfair way that gets people kicked out of their homes, that gets people to lose the businesses because they're not able to afford the increasing taxes, which are not associated. Many times these increases are not associated with services. They're associated with somehow development around your area causing the value, the alleged value of your house to skyrocket.
So in your mind, Dr. Becker, what does fair property tax look like, if there is such a thing?
Well, yeah, well, first off, I just want to make sure we're focused on fair, unfair. Remember, this is just a word we used
Sure.
in the sponsoring group committee's name.
Yep.
Okay. And we did that specifically because we are getting rid of valuation based. We're not saying there can never be a tax on property. Property owners receive services. No one's going to get a free ride here. We're not talking about a free ride. What we're talking about is, number one, huge tax relief, because everything that everyone pays in property taxes in 2025, they are going to keep in their pocket the next year, the next year, the next year. They keep that money. But the incremental increases that the cities, counties, school districts need to raise beyond that level, they will have the power to do that. And they can do it by applying those taxes to property owners based on, it could be any number of things, based on a parcel or a lot or square footage or acreage or road frontage. The nice thing is they can tailor it. The local subdivisions can tailor it according to what is best for the people in those subdivisions. So we can get away from some of the unfair components of property tax when we get away from valuation based, and we get away from starting foreclosure process where the county begins takeover of your property after 2.5 years of not paying your property tax. So you can apply a fee, let's just say snow removal. Right. You need to have an increase this year because there's more snow removal needs, snow removal equipment. And so there's going to be a fee, a tax, really they're interchangeable terms in most instances. And it's going to be based on how much of your property is sitting on a road, because that would actually be more like an appropriate user fee.
Sean, as far as going to the city and, if this does get passed, get on the ballot and get passed, setting the limits, because I know, like I said, taxes are a touchy subject for a lot of people. So to what point does a city leader or a city group say, wow, that taxes, that you're implementing now, as opposed to kind of worked in, gets a little bit too high for someone's liking?
So if you ask anybody what any reasonable amount is, their answer is never going to be a set amount. It's zero. That's the reasonable amount for a fair tax. And I say that tongue in cheek because nobody likes paying tax. There is no right answer to really that question, Nick. I think the main component, and I think we could probably talk for hours on end about how this could work for city services and fees for service. If you call the fire department, it's a $500 bill. If you call the police, it's a $100 bill. I want to get to the nuts and bolts, really, of why I just have a challenge with this idea. It's not the idea in general. It's this idea is, what is the plan? Because we're talking about fees and taxes and stuff like this. With all of the different taxing authorities in North Dakota, it's $1.3 billion, and that's coming off of the Office of the State Tax Commissioner's page itself. $1.3 billion a year. The general fund revenue by source per year, and I know it's broken down by biennium, is actually about $2.485 billion per year right now with the state general fund. So then the question is, where are we coming up with that $1.3 billion, whether that's on the state level, because it is talking about within the wording of this proposal that the state shall pay. It just doesn't say how. If we take a look at the oil tax revenues from the oil and gas extraction tax, and I had to print this off of the state because it is a very detailed bucket list that Senator Rich Warner had created along with the state legislature here a few years ago, that is already helping supplement to the cities for hub city funding in counties and schools and all sorts of different things. If those are the dollars that we're going after to help pay this $1.3 billion, it's actually just kind of double counting some dollars. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but if we're pulling all of those dollars out, that hub city funding and a lot of those other revenues just go away. So we have to be very mindful of really what we're doing. And here's the other important part that we identified when we were looking at sales tax revenues to try to balance our budget is that is very cyclical and up and down. If we are looking at oil tax revenues, that is a commodity driven market. We saw this in $100 oil, $140 oil, all the way down to the negatives when things bottomed out here a few years back. So that could be a very difficult thing to count on, and having to tap into perhaps the legacy fund itself that is also being utilized for major infrastructure projects around North Dakota: flood control, water project, NAWS, WAS, the Red River water supply. There's just the challenge I have is, what is the plan? Because it's not laid out. And if it's just passed as is, it's going to be up to the state legislature to figure that out. And if we're going to change our constitution, that's a sacred document to me. If we're going to change our state's constitution, I would like to see a well thought out plan that we're actually going to say, yep, this is how we're going to do it. This is how it's going to work, rather than just saying we need to get rid of it and that we'll figure it out later.
Dr. Becker, a lot of our viewers were asking
Yes.
about the legacy fund. That came in as one of the big,
Right.
Yeah.
Let me address some of that. So first off, I agree. The Constitution is a document that is sacrosanct and should not be changed willy-nilly, which is exactly why the language in the measure is what it is. It should not be laid out in the Constitution how you're going to pay for it, because that would change. The situation changes constantly as the legislature meets biennially. How they pay for it one year may be different than how they pay for it the next year. Those types of things belong in statute. You don't see that in an appropriately written constitutional amendment. When it comes to the $1.3 billion per year, that's correct, except that's not what we're replacing. The 1.3, the 2.6 per biennium, $1.3 billion per year includes special assessments. It includes other special taxes. It includes bonding that has been as a general obligation bond to property taxes. Those things are not included in what we're replacing. So you get down to closer to $1 billion per year quite easily. And then, of course, you're not going to need property tax credits, because that wouldn't apply anymore. And so you actually get down to definitely $1 billion or less. And so going forward then on how we would replace that. First off, it's intellectually dishonest, because this is the legislators do it all the time, and they talk about how much is in the general fund as though that's what we're paying from. In North Dakota especially, we have effectively two general funds. One is the SIF fund, the Strategic Investment Improvement Fund. We know that we transfer hundreds of millions of dollars between the general and the SIF. North Dakota has many funds. When elected officials talk about, well, we got to focus on the general fund, that's a misdirection. It's not what we really have in North Dakota. Now, we have a tremendous amount of revenue in North Dakota. We had, at the end of the last biennium, $3 billion extra than we thought we were going to have. We are currently at the end of this current biennium looking at right now on track for having $1 billion left over. So when you start at $1 billion or less per year, and you know that you can use some of the legacy fund earnings, not the legacy fund principal, which is really an appropriate way to pay for it. And then you start tweaking down. You don't have to get into hub city funding and take that out. There is so much extra. You look at the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that, because the state has so much revenue, the legislators have all these creative, great ways to spend your money. And a lot of it is giving hundreds of millions of dollars to private companies. That should go back to the people of North Dakota. People say, well, we should be like Alaska, all this oil money, we should give it back to the people. Well, we're prohibited from doing that, but this is a way to do it, because that $1 billion a year will come from the state's clearly excessive spending, and will be then transferred to fill the pot to the locals, so that the citizens of North Dakota will keep what they had been paying in property taxes forevermore. The state has a tremendous amount of revenue. The dips, we've seen 2 dips in oil prices, 2015 and 2020. And by looking at those numbers, we would have gone through those dips very, very readily had this been in place at that time.
So you're confident that we can rely on the legacy fund for something like this if this passes for years to come?
Okay, well, no. What I'm saying is that a portion of the legacy fund earnings can be used to help do the replacement.
Okay.
For instance, we just said the replacement's going to be about $1 billion a year. We could use 150 to 200 million from legacy fund earnings, and that would help buy it down. And what you can do is look at all of these little areas in the state where we have money sitting, where we continue to have excessive spending, and you pick here, you pick here, you pick here, and you realize, wow, we can pay for this quite easily.
And I think that that's perhaps where we disagree. The special assessment number is actually about another 226 million, 1.56. That's coming from the Office of the Tax Commissioner, but what's $226 million in the bigger discussion in total honesty here. I think where we have a disagreement is that the value, the numbers are being double counted.
It's $2.6 billion is total property tax for the biennium, right? That includes all special assessments.
2.6. Now, are you talking to the state, or are you talking on the local side of there, Dr. Becker?
The state. I mean, the state doesn't have property tax. So the total property tax is $2.6 billion a year, and they include in that bucket special assessments. I just want to
for the biennium.
That's correct.
It's about 3.02 billion. If you go off the state's tax commissioners with total special assessments, total is about 3.0. 3.0
is that for a future year or the most recent year?
That is the current 2022 numbers that have just come in.
Oh, okay. I'm looking at I wouldn't have had access to those, so I'm looking at the year before, and Legislative Council provided my numbers to me. So.
No, and that's fine because it's early in the year, but I think more so what I was getting at is that there's not just myself, but a lot of other folks that have run these numbers to the end and have come up with different numbers on what you're saying, that we're going to have all of this extra revenue, with a lot of that revenue being pushed into big chunks of that into major infrastructure projects and other spending. Now, I'm not going to disagree to say that the state or any locals have the ability to cut some spending on certain items, but we have to take a look at what's in front of us now, and we can't absolutely say or tell another city what their priorities are. And that kind of drives back to that local control side of it. So here's again the question: if the city or the counties or the townships are going to say, you know, we need to put gravel on a road and replace this bridge, and they submit that, it goes up to the state. This is again the questions of how this is going to work. Is it a group of bureaucrats that are making that decision? Is it going to be the legislature that has to approve then all of those local budgets that are coming into the state? Or is it a shall be funded? And if that is the case, shall be funded, I could absolutely see spending going through the roof.
No, that's the Doug Burgum misinterpretation of the measure. There's nothing like that whatsoever. The state must replace at 2024 levels. There's no shall be funded in there. And there's nothing weird or confusing about it for local officials. Local officials will do what they've always done, which is they determine their budget for the upcoming year. That's not going to change. Why would that change? The legislature is going to replace. They just look in the statistical report that the tax commissioner has on property tax. They look at page 22 and they see, okay, these subdivisions got this much in 2024. Boom, that's what they get replaced.
So we're locking in prices forever at 2024.
There's no involvement whatsoever. Yeah, okay.
Gentlemen,
you're misrepresenting. Locked in is what the state replaces to the locals. Yes, that's locked in. There's no spending lock-in. The local officials will determine what their budget is, just like they do now. And they know that they're going to get a huge block up to 2024 levels from the state. Everything they want above that, as they budget for, they know they need to go to the people of their subdivision and raise that revenue, just like they would do if property tax was in place. They would have to increase property taxes. Here, what they're doing is saying, okay, that incremental increase, we're going to need that. We're going to have to tax the people, just like they would before, except not with a valuation-based property tax. Total control is retained by the locals.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to have to ask you both to take 20 seconds apiece for a final word. Dr. Becker?
Sure. Well, so what we have is an opportunity, unlike any other state, where we can give this major tax relief to the citizens of North Dakota that they've been asking for and have not received. And at the same time, we can provide tremendous tax reform, something that the legislature has refused. The concerns about local control, as you've been hearing on this podcast, are basically misunderstandings, whether intentional or not. They're misunderstandings of how things are going to go in the future. There's no aspect of, gosh, every time we do a little something, we're going to have to go to you and tax you more. That's not the case. We're going to have to go to the state. Absolutely not the case. It's a misrepresentation of how things will go. The elected officials will conduct business like they always have in determining what's best for the people in their subdivision. This gives the locals more control. This gives the individual voters much more control.
Sean, quickly.
I think my final closing statements would be this. For people that are going to go out and vote, do your research, go through and find out what that information is. Talk to any of your local folks on what it is your property taxes actually pay for locally. And that should be able to actually get you the information that you need for, I think, an informed decision. That's what a lot of folks unfortunately just rely on, just short news, little clips. Again, no offense, Nick, but it's an in-depth piece that needs a lot of research by yourself and to be an informed voter. And more importantly, go out and vote. We need higher numbers out at the polls.
Well, and again, that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have both of you on, very passionate about this issue. Of course, we wanted to clear up any sort of misconceptions, perhaps from our viewers, anyone else that's just tuning in for the first time, learning about this issue or knowing very little and wanting to learn more. So again, we want to thank Dr. Rick Becker, former Mayor Sean Sitma. Thank you so much. And of course, we will be back next Monday with another episode with questions and answers affecting you and your community. Remember, it's your voice that matters. The voice of the people. I'm Nicholas Kwolek. We'll see you next time.